Okay, but we're all adults, so you know what you need, right? And so you know you can ask me if you need it. All right, so we're going to move on. We talked about quantity and we talked about quality. Those things mean something. What does quantity mean?
The amount.
The amount of what? Can't just stop and tell me what the amount. Tell me the amount of what?
The amount of X-rays.
The amount of X-rays inside of the...
Or the beam, like where the
beam. The beam. The beam. So we're talking about the amount of X-rays inside of the beam. If we were to count all of those X-ray photons, that would be beam quantity. Now, what is beam quality?
The power of the X-ray beam.
So what does power mean at this point? So what do you think power is? How would you describe power, since we didn't go over chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4, and so on and so forth? What would you think power is? It described it in this chapter.
The energy of X-ray.
The what?
The energy of X-ray beam. The power would be the energy of X-ray.
Well, it's the energy. It's the energy of the X-ray beam, but that still doesn't tell me what that means. So it's the energy. What does it mean?
Penetration.
The penetration. What is the ability of that photon to go all the way, thank you, Asais, to go all the way through the patient? Where do we need that photon eventually to land? This is 101. We talked about this in the summer. Where do we need the photons to land eventually?
In the IR.
In the IR. So we're throwing all these photons at the image receptor so that the image receptor can catch them. So if the photon does not have enough energy, penetrating power, it is likely going to be stopped by the body in front of the image receptor and never reach it. We have no image if that happens, right? If every photon was absorbed by the body, we would not have an image. We would have a blank screen. So we need a variety of photons to reach the image receptor, and that is going to be how we manipulate the beam quality. If it's a low quality beam...
This when you up the KVP?
We will. That is the primary factor that takes care of beam quality. However, we need to understand what the difference is between beam quantity and beam quality. Make sense? Yes? No? Possibly? We understand the difference between beam quality and beam quantity?
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate you. So there are some technical factors. The technical factors are the factors that we select on the operator console. So Javier mentioned KVP controls quality. KVP controls quality, not mass. Mass controls what?
The quality.
Nope, not quality.
Quantity.
Quantity. Mass controls quantity. Beam quantity, not quality. So we're going to have to say that about 1,000 times because this is forever going to be utilized in this program from now on. So this is like a step. If we cannot move forward understanding that what beam quality is over beam quantity, we are going to be stuck here at this moment for 2 years. Does everyone understand that? So, beam quantity again, explain it to me. And I'm only saying this because I have experience. I have experience here.
In quantity is mass.
How so, Daniel? How is quantity mass? What does mass stand for?
It's like the amount of something, right? The amount of.
Mass stands
Is it
for
weight?
ampere and second. Milliampere and seconds. Seconds is a unit of measure. When we use seconds, we measure something. So MA and time are not beam quantity. Beam quantity is the amount of photons in the X-ray beam. So mass is not beam quantity. Mass controls beam quantity. How?
Does it control the number of electrons that are boiled off of the filament?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we adjust our MA and our time, together known as mass, we determine how many electrons are being boiled off the filament. That number or quantity of electrons will have a direct impact on how many photons are created. So mass controls beam quantity because it controls how many electrons are being boiled off. Absolutely correct. You should be filling that in on your chart. How does KVP control beam quality?
It increases the beam's ability to penetrate the body.
Yep. It is that boost. KVP is that boost. It is that boost of energy. When you think of KVP, you think of Red Bull. You think of something. Why would you drink a Red Bull? Why do people drink Red Bull, caffeine, all of these stimulants? Why do people do that? Luke is demonstrating for us. Thank you, Luke. What is it given for it? What is it providing you?
Energy, the will to know in the mornings.
It is giving you a boost of stimulant. You are now feeling energized. So what are you going to achieve with that rest of that energy that you just supplemented into your body? What are you going to achieve?
Study more.
Stay awake. Beautiful. So if we can bump up our KVP, fill our photons with energy by bumping up our KVP, we don't want our photons to stay awake because they're already awake, but we want them to travel. And where do we want them to travel, Luke?
To the X-ray, to the image receptor.
Thank you. To the image receptor. So it's all about the image receptor, isn't it? We want to produce that image. So we want to make sure that we provide enough energy and enough sources, liberated electrons, to create that quantity of photons in our X-ray beam so that we have both beam quality and beam quantity every time we go to the console to select. Make sense? We want our photons to get the job done right. Questions? All right, so no questions, so let's keep moving. So the half value layer is basically a measurement for beam quality, not quantity, beam quality. So beam quality means how energized is our beam? How much of our beam is going to penetrate the objective, the body part, reach the image receptor? So this half value layer is the measurement for beam quality. Okay? We know that tube filtration is going to do what, Wani? What is tube filtration going to do?
It will filter out the photons that we don't need.
Yep, it's going to filter out those weak, low quality photons, right? It's going to filter those out. So when we're thinking about the half value layer, we're not talking about tube filtration. How much tube filtration do we need total, Naomi?
2.5 millimeters
Of?
aluminum.
There you go. Good. So that's tube filtration. That is a standard. That is basically saying the FDA, the NRC, everyone is requiring that you operate your machine safely at a total filtration of 2.5 millimeters of aluminum. However, the half value layer is a quality check. It is a quality check. It is defined as the thickness of the absorbing material. Whatever that material is going to be. Most times it is aluminum. We like aluminum. But whatever the thickness of that absorbing material going to be to reduce the energy. Energy. One second. It is the energy of the beam. So whatever that thickness is going to reduce the energy of the beam by 1/2 its original intensity. What does intensity mean again, Pamela? What's the definition of intensity? Energy of the amount and energy of the X-ray beam. So the overall intensity, because remember I said, I don't like intensity. Every other source has said is always the amount of beam quantity. However, in this resource, and I can definitely see why, I do understand why, it uses the word intensity to also incorporate the quality, the energy of the beam. So whatever absorbing material is going to work, to function, that we're reducing to half of its original intensity, that's what the half value layer does. And so what's the point of it? We want to make sure that our beam is of quality. Yeah, we have tube filtration. Yeah, we know we're getting 2.5 millimeters of aluminum to filter out the weed out the weak photons. But how strong is our beam altogether? And we can determine that, how strong it is, by the half value layer. Okay? Most times, because we do have a diagnostic range of how much did I tell you guys? What is our diagnostic range?
30 to 150.
Yes, kVp, right? So here on that diagnostic beam range, the normal half value layer to determine the beam quality is anywhere from 3 to 5 millimeters of aluminum. Are we using this every time we expose? No. This is a quality check, meaning when they come in and they run diagnostics on our machine, how do we know that our beam is of quality? They perform a half value layer diagnostic check. Make sense? So do not get half value layer confused with tube filtration. Tube filtration is required. Half value layer is a quality check. Questions?
So you're talking about beam intensity's got to be reduced out to half.
I'm sorry, Mr. John, and I can barely hear what you're saying.
Can you hear me out?
A little bit. Sounds kind of far, but it's okay. Just go ahead.
I'm trying to understand. So the original intensity wants to be down to half of what it's supposed to be, or what it's coming out.
Right.
So
okay, keep going.
So when we set kVp,
yes,
set it to 100. Is that factoring in? It's already factored in the half value layer. So
it's what it's basically saying is, how do you know 100 kVp is behaving like 100 kVp? So if we're doing this quality check and we say we've put in 100 kVp, So wouldn't our half value layer be 50?
Okay, so that's my question is if we put in 100 on the console, 100
Yeah.
intensity that's going to be coming up actually moving 50 kVp, or is it we put 100 in, it's like it was producing 200, but since it's now frequency at half that intensity, it comes out as 100. You understand what I'm much more making that clear?
No, I'm not quite understanding. I think this is just the way that, you may have said it, but I'm having problems hearing you because it's cutting out just a little bit, at least for me. And we can talk on the phone afterwards just to make sure that I answer it. But this is more of a quality check. How do I know that my machine is functioning? How do I know that my beam is of quality? So I'm going to absorb half of it and then try to measure it with my device and measure it and see. And I should know that whatever I selected, this is a way of performing that check to see that. But one of the things, though, that I do want you to understand, the half value layer doesn't, even though it's not tube filtration, obviously it's absorbing material that's going to reduce the energy of the beam. However, this is also going to harden the beam. It's going to be, the material may come in, it's going to be less intense meaning photon quantity and energy. So you're reducing the amount of photons and that energy that it carried, right? But now that photon is gone. So it's like saying you have 8 exams and they're sprinkled out between 30 to 150. That was your total scores. If you average those test exams together, your number's going to go low because of that 30, right? But if you reduce that number, if you eliminate that 30, your test score is higher. And that's the only way that I can relate it to right now. Do you have a higher energy overall because you've reduced the weaker photons, if that makes any sense? But right now, I need you to understand the half value layer is a quality check. It's a measurement of the quality of the beam. It's a way to make sure that our beam, whatever we're selecting on our KVP, is reflecting. Okay?
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, we can talk about it a little bit more. So here we have primary beam. So there's 2 definitions here. There's a primary beam and there's a remnant beam. Remnant beam is also known as exit radiation. So when the X-rays leave the source, before they interact with the objective, the patient, the chest, the finger, the hand, the elbow, the knee, whatever it is, the X-rays are in the primary beam. Please take this note down. So the X-rays leaving the source before they reach the image of the patient is the primary beam. The X-rays leaving the patient, leaving the anatomy, is called the remnant radiation. It is remnant of what was once there. Make sense? Because we know that all of the X-rays that are being released from the source are going to encounter the body. They may be absorbed, they may be angled in direction. So whatever X-rays reach the image receptor after leaving the body is called remnant, or sometimes called exit. Questions? So primary beam, we know where that's at. Remnant beam, we know where that's at. So the X-rays coming to primary, X-rays leaving the patient to the image receptor, remnant.
Is the scatter radiation, is that considered part of the remnant beam?
Scatter radiation is going to be another subject that we're going to talk about, I believe, next chapter. And this actual X-ray never reaches the image receptor, so it's not part of the remnant. It is only the X-rays that reach the image receptor. The primary beam intended to reach. However, it's the remnant radiation that actually reaches.
Sorry, so the primary is like what's the beam to the patient, and then the remnant is the patient to the IR.
Okay, yeah. So if you aim your tube and you're positioning whoever at the wall bucky, the X-rays before reaching the patient is part of the primary beam. Now, the patient to the image receptor, all of the X-rays that leave the patient and reach the image receptor is the remnant beam. So my question here is, which beam, primary remnant, will have a higher energy or beam quality?
Will it be the primary?
Why would it be the primary?
Is it because it's leaving the X-ray?
Because it has not interacted with anything other than air. Absolutely correct. So you're starting to put together what is energy, what is quality. Good job, Aurora. Some of y'all are just staring at me. I don't know. I don't know what that means. Staring at me, maybe staring at the slide, but I need to hear you. I won't know what you're thinking until you talk to me. Okay, emission spectrum. So this is another area where we're looking to see and we're measuring energy and quantity. Okay, quantity and quality, to be more specific. So we're measuring not only quality, like the half-value layer, because the half-value layer is an absorbing substance to reduce the energy level of the primary being, one half of what it originally was. Okay. The emission spectrum is basically graphs. They're depicting the energy levels, the quality and the quantity of the beam in a graph form. Okay, so let's go back and review just a little bit. So when we think about the emission spectrum, it's used to graph and represent the energies of the X-ray beam. But energies is also going to be in reference, because energies would tell us, like the Red Bull, right? The power of the photon. But it's also going to tell us how many photons are there, okay? So this definition is emissions, just in case we're trying to understand why is this the emission spectrum. Emission is the production and discharge of something. So what are we discharging out of the X-ray tube? What is being discharged out of the X-ray tube?
Photons.
Or X-ray.
Photons, X-rays, whatever you want to call them. Photons and X-rays, they mean the same thing. So this is basically determining what spectrum, what graph is going to determine of what we're discharging, okay? So right here, I need to review kinetic energies. So let's review. Someone explain to me, what is the kinetic energies for BREM? What happens with kinetic energies and BREM? Explain that process to me. How did we get kinetic energy to BREM? Or what is BREM?
The filament electrons pass through to get close to the nucleus.
Okay.
Of the atom.
The filament electron has that kinetic energy. It's utilizing its kinetic energy and it flows close to the nucleus. And then what happens, Jonan?
Then, since the nucleus has a positive charge, it attracts the electron, and depending on how close the electron is drawn to it, it's going to use its kinetic energy to slow down and turn, and then that kinetic energy that it ends with is, so it starts with the kinetic energy amount and ends with the kinetic energy amount, and the difference that's produced.
Well, yes. Okay, so let me go ahead and just, yes, you're right. So the filament electron is coming in, it possesses kinetic energy because it's motion, right? Yes, it doesn't dispense all of its kinetic energy, but because the nucleus is so attractive, meaning that the filament electron gets closer, because it wants to go, it's almost like the electron is passing it up because it possesses so much energy. right? Kinetic energy. It's like you know how when you drive past something that you want to turn into and you make that little, that's what's happening. It's pulling back on the attraction. The nucleus is pulling back and saying, hey, you're attracted to me this way. So instead of the filament going forward, it changes direction and continues to move. When it breaks and changes that direction, the energy, the kinetic energy, some of the kinetic energy that was causing it to race by is released in that photon, which we know to be a Brem photon. Correct? Yes? Jonan, we said the same thing, but I think that's where we're going, right? So that's the kinetic energy that is going to eventually lead us to a Brem photon. Great job. All right, someone else besides Jonan, give me characteristics and kinetic energy. Okay, Valen.
It's
All
the
right, John. Help me, John.
Let's see. The filament electron interacts with one of the electrons of the tungsten anode in one of the shells, and it hits one of them and it knocks it out of the orbit. So there's a vacancy there, and then all the other electrons that are on the outer shells cascade in. They all fall into place to fill in the void.
Right.
Cascading produces characteristic photons.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So the kinetic energies here for characteristic was really just ionizing an electron out of its shell to start the binding energies to form, right? So the release of the binding energy starts to go off into that photon, right? So we all understand that there was a conversion of energy, and that because energy is not going to be created or destroyed, where we are converting energy, okay? So, and what does a photon mean by definition, Jaleisha? How often have I referred to it as
A photon? It's an X-ray
yeah,
beam.
photon. It is an X-ray, but what is it defined as?
Energy.
Okay. All right. A bundle of energy. It's just a bundle of energy, meaning it's kind of like you think of light photons, or if you think of a photon, it's a bundle of energy that can travel as a particle, or it can travel in waves. Okay? And so that's where we start to get that X-ray beam. Beautifully done, Jaleisha. Thank you. So, when we're looking, any questions before we go into emission spectrum?
Can I just clarify one thing about the characteristic? So I'm understanding correctly that kinetic energy in that interaction, the movement of the filament electron, it strikes one of the shell electrons, and it displaces it, right?
Right.
That's the kinetic energy part, right?
Correct.
And then at that point, a photon isn't produced. It's only in the cascade.
Correct.
Kinetic energy part is the
It's just getting to start the ionization, start the cascading. Only to start the cascading.
Whereas the other one, the kinetic energy is like the whole thing. Like it
Correct.
goes in and then it gets flung out.
Right.
Because of that interaction in an X-ray.
Correct. Absolutely. And so that's why we have the majority of Brem. We have more majority of Brem, and that's what we're going to talk about here in the emission spectrum, identifying Brem over characteristic. So the other question that I have, let me go ahead and start voluntold. Sharon, what is the KeV required for a filament electron kinetic energy to possess to remove a K-shell orbiting electron? What kind of KeV should the the kinetic energy have of the filament electron in order to remove a K shell electron? Look at your chart for binding energies.
I know what is the binding energy is, but I don't get the question.
So what's the binding energy for K?
So the binding energy is like to put the energy like together.
No, but what is the number? What's the number for K?
69.5.
Good. So in order to eject a binding energy of 69.5, can the filament electron have anything less than 69 keV? No. So a filament electron has to possess enough kinetic energy to sufficiently start characteristic, which means higher than 69 keV. How do we get our filament electrons, Jessley, higher than 69 keV? I can't hear you, Jessley.
So isn't that
how do we get our filament electrons to travel at 69 keV? Kilo electron volts.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that? What can we do as an operator to get our filament electrons to travel or start characteristic cascading?
Okay, so what we can increase the
what?
KVP.
We can. To how much minimum in order to start characteristic interactions?
Was that the 6.5 or something? Or
like 5? How much was the binding energy, Jessley?
Oh, 16.
So we need minimum 69.5 in order to break that bond. So how do we set that on our KVP? We select 70.
Oh, okay.
There we go, right? So if we want to increase the the kinetic energies of our filament electron to start characteristic, the minimum setting of KVP we can select on our operating console must be greater than the K shell binding energy. I'll say that one more time. In order to initiate characteristic photon formation, cascading, the highest binding energy is that K shell electron. So we, as operators, to start characteristic, must minimally set our KVP, kilovoltage peak, at 70. Or if we don't, we will have no characteristic in photons. So if we have a KVP, and this was on the Merciful Maestra, I think I put 65 on there. If you chose 65 KVP, how many characteristic photons will emerge out of your tube? 0. You have to have enough of the binding energy of K. Why do we like K, Jolie? Why do we like the K shell to be ejected?
Okay, it said the highest binding energy.
It's going to give us the highest photon. Thank you. That's beautiful. You guys are getting it. I love it. Love it. It's coming together. We're like this puzzle piece right here. This is what we're doing. We're connecting pieces. Okay? Any questions about what I just went over?
If you set it at 69, would that be sufficient to ionize it?
It has to be greater.
Has to be greater. Okay.
Because if it does not eject it, then it just excites it.
Okay.
Has to be greater. It's almost like, I don't know. I think got one picture I put in my old slides. I don't know why I didn't. You know, the sumo wrestlers. You know, bigger, better. You know, you got to push one out of the ring. You have to have the equivalent type of force to do that. So how do we do that? We get the potential difference to go up to match it or greater, but it's more likely greater, not match it, because then we run into the probability of excitation and not ionization. Make sense? Jonan?
Yes, it does.
Awesome. Perfect. Good. All right, so reading the graph. On this x-axis, the horizontal axis, which is our x-axis, so think back to high school, to math, college algebra, so on and so forth. The x-axis is the horizontal axis. The y-axis is the vertical axis. So on the x-axis, we're talking about energy. We're talking about what we are selecting on our KVP. So this is the amount of energy, penetrating power of our photons. The y-axis is saying amplitude, number, quantity of photons in our X-ray beam. So this graph is depicting our BRIM photons, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So here at this energy level, we have the highest amount of photons generated. Here at 40, I guess, I don't know what the number would be right here, but I'm going to take an educated guess, maybe 40, 42. Thank you, Jessley. All right, so here we know that at this energy level, we have the highest amount of photons, okay? Even though we selected right over here, because we can never have any more than a higher energy than what we selected. Make sense? So this y-axis is the number of photons, being quantity, and the x-axis is being quality. Everybody agree? Right? You're like, yep, agree. So how do we generate these? We select our KVP. And the number of photons and the energy value will be determined or depicted by an emission spectrum. So here's another fact. The BRIMS photon is going to create a bell-shaped curve. No, it doesn't look like a bell, but this is called a bell-shaped curve. Okay? Now, what did we just say, Jaleisha, about characteristic? Would we have on this graph any characteristic photons generated in our quality, our primary beam?
Yes.
Yes. Why? Why would we have any characteristics in here?
Because they have the highest amount of energy.
Right, we would. But what KVP did we select here?
70.
70, it's almost like 90, right? Somewhere close, but over 75. We know that the K binding energy is right here, but we selected higher, so we know we would have characteristic X-rays. Make sense? Because our selection of KVP was over here, about 90 KVP. So we know with that selection of KVP, we will have characteristic X-rays in our beam, correct? It's unavoidable, right? Not as much as BRIMS, but we will have. If we stopped our KVP selection here, then no, we would not have any BRIM photons. Make sense? Yes? No? Possibly? Are we just saying yes at this point? Okay. All right. So characteristic photons are represented not by a bell curve, but by a spike. So what it's basically saying, because we're limited to how many characteristic X-rays are in our X-ray beam, because it's totally dependent on what we select. Totally dependent. How many of you have been at the clinics and you've done a hand? What KVP have you chosen as baby?
They don't let us. Well, where I was at the EC, they kind of choose it for you. The only thing you just click on the hand and it's automatic. They don't, because they know we haven't done it. They kind of always check for us, to be honest.
Okay, but what about at the outside clinics? Who's done that? Because I know my techs at the outside clinic. They tell you to start touching the buttons. Anybody? No.
We do it at Valvona, but it's kind of automatically set. It's like set for like I think 45.
Right. But if you go back, so now is a great opportunity for you to start looking at your KVP selections. Because now you know what kind of X-ray photons are exiting your tube. If you're not higher than 70 KVP, you have zilch characteristic. All brim, 100% brim. Make sense? So start paying attention to when your KVP goes high and when your KVP goes low. That's going to be essential when we go into the next chapter. Okay? So because we did select the KVP high to about 90 right here, we are going to see spikes of characteristic X-rays. All right? Now, the word discrete is used. Discrete, by definition, write this down. Discrete, by definition, means accurate, exact. Accurate, exact. Discrete emission spectrum is basically saying accurate or exact values. How would we know what the characteristic X-rays are? How would we know that? Haven't we talked about that already? How would we know what the values of each photon would be? Theoretically speaking. Theoretically. We've covered it.
We know that the characteristic.
Yeah. How would we tell the characteristic photon values? How could it be discrete?
I thought we were doing the math, like when you did the exam, but I'm probably confused over the 100 K 30, and then it gives you 70. But I might be
talking about binding energies. Talking about binding energy. Thank you, Naomi. We're talking about the binding energy differences. You were given a chart with binding energies. So we have specific values. How do we know these values? Because it's tungsten. We've studied tungsten. So the material that we're using, we already know those values. We know that K is 69. L is whatever. Seems like no one cares about LMNOP. It's all about the K. That's going to be the next T-shirt, by the way. It's all about the K. All right. So we know those energies. Let's see. Okay. All right. So that's why it's called discrete, because it's accurate, because we have a chart telling us the binding energies of tungsten, K shell, L shell, M, N, O, and P, right? Well, P doesn't have anything. There's no binding energy. Okay. Or too little to identify. So now let's talk about parts of the emission spectrum. Now, if you don't have a number at the top, this is new, so take a picture. You don't have a number, and I've rearranged it so better understanding. The left side of the curve at 0, and the right side of the curve touches at the axis of the KVP selected. So we start off at 0, right? 0 emissions, right? And then what we selected. So we know pretty much what the operator selected. One of the things that you really need to understand, because even though we selected the speed, the KeV of our filament electrons, we didn't quite achieve a high number at this selection. So the rule of thumb, and this is about as efficient as we can go, is the peak of the curve, which is right here, the peak of this curve, because this is a curve and a graph, is approximately 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of the KVP selected. The peak of the curve, or the value of the, is about 1/3 of what we selected. So most of, what does that basically say? Most of our photons, does everyone see me? Most of our photons under this peak of the curve are valued between 25 and 45 keV. Not at the 90 keVP we selected. Yes? No? Gotcha, Miss Lara. I'm reading a curve. I'm excited. I'm reading a graph. I'm starting to understand this, the gibberish of this graph. Yes? No? Touchdown? All right. So we can select it, but rule of thumb, most of our photons are valued at 1/3 of our original selection. Make sense? It's just the way it is. Remember back in Rinkin's days, we've gotten better images, we've got better equipment, but how we create X-ray has not been improved by much. Maybe you guys just give me credit for being your PRE teacher, discovering that path. That's all I ask for, recognition. Any questions there? Do we understand what we're looking at? The number of photons on this side is measured. So if we were to have 1, 2, 3, 5,000, whatever, this would be the whole, thank you, the dedication. Thank you very much, Justly. So this would be the number of photons, but only at this value do we have the most. Okay? At this energy level, do we have the most? Make sense? Yay! So discrete emission spectrum is specifically to characteristic. Those are spikes, remember? Yes? So again, discrete is because it is exact values. We know what the characteristic photon value is because of the binding energy chart we have. Ms. Laura, will we need to know the other binding energies besides K? They're not worthy, right? They're going to be absorbed by our, what are they going to be absorbed by? Ooh, let me see. Amy, what are the characteristic photons? L, M, N, O, well, sometimes L. M, N, O, P. What are they going to be absorbed by? Or O? What is going to absorb that?
I feel like it was heat. No.
Did you say tube filtration? Exact. Tube filtration. You're not going to exit. You're not going to go anywhere. Our tube filtration is going to take it and handle it, right? Because our tube filtration absorbs those weak photons, right? Good. So the height of the bars relative to the Y, and this sounds very, very scientific, super scientific, but what is it basically telling us? This is the level of energy. So at this energy, how many X-rays did we have? How many did we have if we counted? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's just basically, don't let it confuse you. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you understand some of this. So we know the number of X-rays, and this is the energy level and this amount. So here we had this many amount, K X-rays. This one, the L's got through, but see their value? Nothing. Not valuable whatsoever. All right, so this is just basically indicating, again, how to look at these images. We know that we're looking at characteristics because we're looking at lines. If we were looking for a continuous graph, we would be looking at brim. And BRIM is going to look like this, and also called continuous. Okay? So, when we're talking about the emission spectrum, you have this in your slides. The continuous portion is for BRIM, and the discrete is for characteristic. Okay? When we put it all together, we're basically just determining the beam quality and the beam quantity. Beam quality and beam quantity. Okay? That's all that is. So let's find out how our factors, your chart affects it. So we know the quantity or the number of photons, our y-axis, our quality, the energy level of our x-axis, can be affected by MA, right? We know that. Yes? What does MA control again? Quantity. Good. What does KVP control? I can't read it. I can't read if you're saying quantity or quality.
Quality.
Quality. Good. We know that tube filtration is going to do what again?
Take out the weak.
Weak photons. The generator type, we talked a little bit about earlier with John and said, I'm not going to have you worry too much about it. I've excluded it because there are different generator types. Generator types are just basically determining what our voltage is going to be or how high our voltage is going to be. But when we get to circuits, we will definitely spend a plethora of time on generators, but not right now. If you notice, this chapter is highly dense of material, and I want to make sure that I stay on schedule. And the target material that we mostly talk about, Aurora, what do we usually talk about?
We're talking about tungsten?
Tungsten. So we normally work with tungsten, but there are other departments that work with different target materials. The one off the top of my head, molybdenum, memo. Memo uses a lower atomic number because they're just basically going through soft tissue, not necessarily bone. Make sense? So sometimes you can use lower target material so that you don't have to overexpose anyone. So that's just different target materials, okay? So what happens when MA, this is your chart now. I'm on your chart. So if you're just looking at it like, oh my God, I don't know what's going on, and she's just giving me all this stuff and I have no clue, here is your chance to start filling it out. So if you look at the bottom and it says factors affecting emission spectrum, here we have MA. We know that MA controls quantity. MA is going to control quantity, okay? Time will too, mass will too. So you can go ahead and put MA in time, it's okay. But right now, it's just saying MA, all right? So an increase in MA increases the amplitude. The amplitude means the height of the curve. The height of the curve represents what again?
Is it the amount of the x-rays?
The number of x-rays. So this many, if there was a number right here, we would know how many. How many? So an increase in MA increases the amplitude or the quantity or the number of x-rays. So if we went from 200 MA to 400 MA, look how we doubled. We doubled our amplitude, right? So on your chart, if you increase MA, what effect does it have on quantity? It increases it. Why? Because you've added more photons by adding more MA. MA controls how many electrons, and more electrons means more photons, right? Good. Everyone good there? Is everyone following me on the chart? Yes? Thumbs up? Good. Perfect. Changes in KVP. Now, KVP means energy. we know that KVP can also put quantity. How do we put quantity in with increasing KVP? How does that happen?
By increasing KVP?
How do we add more photons to the beam by increasing KVP?
The attraction of photons.
Yeah, that's an attraction, but what happens? How do we get more photons generated? Just because there's a higher attraction? It helps. What happens?
They have a higher kinetic energy.
Go ahead.
They have a higher kinetic energy, so there's more potential for, or higher probability of creating photons with having a higher kinetic energy.
Correct. True. So even in BRIM, the velocity is higher, the kinetic energy is higher. Absolutely. But what else? What happens if we increase KVP from here to here? What else are we putting in? What does this represent? Huh?
Characteristic X-ray.
There you go. Characteristic. So we already know. The higher the kinetic energy that the filament electron passes by the brim, we're going to have higher photons that are generated. Perfect. But if we go higher than 69.5 keV, we're also adding a new mix of photons into our beam. Make sense? So KVP does affect how many or quantity, right? Quantity, but not directly like MA did. If you double the MA, you double the amount. Not proportional. It is not, if I double my KVP, I'm going to double the quantity. That doesn't work that way. Got it? Yes? Okay. So, we do know now that KVP increases of the amplitude, but if we increase KV, we've also done what? We have shifted the amplitude to the right. Why? We made the peak of the energy higher than this one. Why? Oops. Why did it shift to the right? What does this x-axis represent?
Because a higher KVP gives you a higher energy photons, so that's why it's going to shift to the right.
Right. So if we have a higher KVP, we know that we are generating 1/3 of the value that is shifting to the right side of the energy spectrum. Right? So if we add higher energy, we're going to have a higher amplitude, not directly like the MA, but it also shifts the energy. It's almost like you have higher test grades, your average becomes higher, right? If you have lower, make sense, test grades, then your average becomes lower. That ringing a bell? Is that kind of correlating a little bit? So the higher the KVP, the higher the energy of your beam, basically. Make sense? So that's why they call it shifting it to the right, right of the energy spectrum, the energy numbers. Okay? Questions? So what did you write for your chart? Anyone? Okay, we'll take a 5-minute because we still got ways to go. So take a 5-minute, go use the restroom, do what you need to do. For those that want to ask questions, now is the time.
I'm sorry, I totally understanding. So the higher KVP, like the higher the, like I'm not really understanding this part.
Okay. Okay, let me put it this way. What part of energy do you not understand energy is, baby, or what do you mean? I mean, what is specifically are you?
I guess I'm a little confused. I guess because I went over the first part of the I guess kind of got confused on the how to correlate characteristic cascade with BREMS and emission spectrum. I guess like emission spectrum and BREMS, I kind of get it together, but then when I try to like think characteristic cascade, I kind of just fall off.
Okay. I think I know what you're talking about. So you're more or less not here with the give me 1 second. Hello. Well, I'm in class right now. Can I call you back in about 30 minutes? All right. Okay. 30 minutes. All right. Sorry, guys. I was just waiting for that phone call. All right. So, okay. Let's go back and look at here.
Can I ask a question that might help us, Betty?
Okay,
that might clarify? So it starts on this graph. So this graph is representative of both interactions, BREM and characteristic.
Right.
And I get that, on the bottom you have the KVP.
Right.
As you turn up the KVP, as you turn that knob higher, the button, whatever, the number of X-rays produced grows more.
Correct.
Like you get more, but it seems like at 30 or 40, like I guess just because of how the filament electron is interacting with the nucleus, like a fall off, like you're not as efficient, right?
Right. It's not as efficient. So it's not like saying, okay, just because you selected your KVP at 80, that you're going to get all your photons to behave or have the energy level of 80. It's just not. It's going to be a polyenergetic or a various type energy beam. And so with the curve, go ahead.
It seems like it has something to do with the material. The filament electrons hitting this material, there's like a drop off at bombarding it with more and more energy. You're not going to get more and more X-rays.
Correct.
And
absolutely. That's with KVP.
That's with KVP, right? And then characteristic X-rays show up on here. This is like 2 graphs in one is what we're looking at. Mm-hmm. We don't get any characteristic interaction until we get to 69.5, until we break AVP of the K shell electron. We don't get this line.
Correct.
I think what's a little bit confusing about this is the BREM is like a continuous representation, and then the characteristic, like 2 different types of lines on the same graph.
Correct.
A little bit confusing.
It is. But if this line stopped right here, then it would just be one graph of BREM. There would be no characteristic because we would never exceed or select the highest energy to initiate characteristic. Right? So if we selected this energy here, we would not have a combo type graph. We would only be looking at BREM.
So if we're turning up the KVP kilovolt, we get that peak on BREM. We keep turning it up, and then when we get to 69, then we get the characteristic.
Correct.
But the characteristic, the way it represents itself on the graph here, like if number of X-rays, if there was 0 to 100, we're getting like this number at the top of the line. Number of X-rays, right?
Right. So this would be, if there was numbers here, then you would be able to say, I had this many characteristic X-rays of this energy. So whatever characteristic starts here, I could have another bar here, not likely, but I can have another bar here, another bar here. But what we're trying to say is this can only happen when this happens. So I do see what you're saying, and thank you, John, for clearing it. Bremsstrahlung is the majority of the photons generated with the interactions for 2 reasons. Because no matter what level of energy you select on your KV, you're going to have Bremsstrahlung interactions, period. This is why we have a diagnostic level of 30 to 150 kVp. So no matter what you select, it's independent of what you select down here, you're going to generate bremsstrahlung. So it's continuous. And it's not trying to, the filament electron is not trying to collide with any electrons in orbit. It's just making contact with the nucleus. Here is totally dependent on the energy selected before you can generate characteristic X-rays.
If I do 75 kV, still getting more characteristic, right?
You're getting more, but not. It's not the entire. So if we did 75 here, we would probably have a few. This spike would probably be smaller in amplitude or height because you would have less. It's less likely. So the higher your kV doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be. But if you hit a kV here, then you should have spikes all the way here, but just at different levels. Does that make sense? So this is just depicting different parts. So if you saw this is representing characteristic. If you're seeing this is a representing curve of bremsstrahlung, which we know is the majority of our X-ray beam.
Moving on for 200 milliamps to 400 milliamps. I mean, you turn up the milliamps, you're increasing the interactions on the end. You're increasing that number. That's what makes that curve spike higher, because there's just more stuff happening. I get that.
So here you had 200 electrons interacting with the anode. Here you had 400 electrons interacting with the anode. So you're going to have double the interactions.
And then that makes sense to me. I get a little bit more confused on the
KVP.
The KVP,
because it does not affect the amplitude directly. When I say something like this has a direct impact. If I double the MA, then I double the effect. Not KVP. KVP, that's why KVP does not control quantity. It affects quantity, but does not control it. By doubling the KVP doesn't give me double the quantity. It raises it.
You do turn up the KVP, you do get more X-rays, more number.
Correct, but not directly proportional. Meaning, if I gave you $1 and I doubled it, then I gave you $2, so you should have exactly the double the amount of that value. If I double my KVP, it is not going to give me double the amount of quantity. So it affects it. It does not control it.
I think my understanding is, I've thought of it like a rifle, like a gun.
Okay.
And if you turn up the milliamps, it's like shooting faster. You turn up the KVP, that's like shooting with a bigger bullet.
Yes. Okay, I can see that. I actually have a video. You just made me think about a video that one of the students made a couple of years ago, because he did it for me for PRE, and I don't know if I'm able to play it over. I can try, but he tried to talk about what is KVP and what is MA and how it affects on the beam. He did a really, really wonderful example. He used a water gun, you know, and the water gun, and it's one of those pumping water guns. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Those pumping water guns? Yes? Okay. So the water inside of the gun is the MA. It's the amount of water that you have. Okay? But the pumping action does what to the water?
More come out.
Huh?
Makes more come out.
It makes more come out more forcefully. The air being pumped into the water gun is making the photons come out more forcefully. That is energy. That is penetrating power. It travels farther. It's forceful. Does that make sense? I have to show you the video. He did a really good job. But
I hope I didn't cut you off.
it's very okay. It's very. So did that conversation help you a little bit, or if not, I'm gonna pick it up today.
Would be you're saying that the KVP does not affect, but I remember looking at the PowerPoint in the book, and I thought in case we had to double the math. Maybe not.
No, if KVP is if KVP is double, it's like no. If the KVP is increased by 15%, it corresponds to like doubling the mass, but does not mean that doubling the KVP will double the number of X-rays. The number of X-rays is controlled by mass alone. Okay, or MA right now, but it will be mass. So what you're thinking about is here, this question. If KVP is doubled, the intensity, you're increasing the what by 4? The quantity. So it's not, you're doubling the KVP, but the MA is being quadrupled. The quantity is being quadrupled. Does that make sense? If you increase the KVP by 15%, not double, then it's like doubling the mass. It has the same effect, but not directly. Like doubling the mass means doubling the photons. No, it's just corresponding to that. It's like.
Okay. So this will be corresponding, but then if we look at a chart, then we can assume that it just doesn't correlate that we would exact number.
So this is what I want you to write. So we have the word affect, means that if I do something and something is affected, right? It's affected. But controlling something means that it is going to, when something goes up, something's either going to go up to match it, or something's going to go down equally to match it. So when we're looking at that, there is an effect, and then there is a control. So when we say, okay, if we doubled the KVP, what happens to the energy?
See what you mean.
If we double the KVP, because KVP controls energy, mass controls quantity. So if we doubled the KVP, we went from 30 kV to 60 kV, then we doubled the energy. Make sense?
Yes.
So there's affecting, but then there is controlling. All right, so here, let's finish out this section. So changes in May, if we double the MA, we double the photons, so we double the quantity of the curve, right? The amplitude, we doubled it by doubling this. If we increase KV, whether 15%, whether doubling, we're not going to double the quantity. However, we are going to increase the energy of the entire X-ray beam. Some is going to be contributed, not directly, not double, not 10 more. It does not have a direct correlation, but it will affect by increasing the quantity, and we discussed why. More photons are going to lose their energy when they get close to the nucleus. There's going to be more kinetic energy lost, right, with the higher KVP. And then you have the opportunity to put K characteristic photons in the beam, okay, giving it a shift to the right. The tube filtration. What is the function of tube filtration?
The weak.
So it weeds out the weak. I like it. So when we increase tube filtration, what happens? Should our quantity go up or should our quantity go down?
Yes.
It should go down. You're right, Dylan. So if I increase my thickness, I went from 2 millimeters of aluminum to 4 millimeters of aluminum. Did it decrease my amplitude? Yes. More absorbing material. So you should put that in your chart. If your tube filtration increased from 2 millimeters to 4 millimeters, what happened to the quantity of X-rays? And then you go back and you figure out what happened to the quality of X-rays. So what happened to the quality of X-rays?
Better.
Increases.
It increases. Why did it increase?
Because it took out the weak photon, so it's better.
It took out the weak, the low exam scores from all of the average, increasing the overall or a higher exam score. Does that make sense? If you have 10 exams and 3 of them are in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and you remove those and you had 80s, 90s, and 100s, your average becomes higher when you reduce the lower or remove the lower. Make sense? So the energy is increased, or the quality of the beam is increased when we add more tube filtration. Does everybody understand that? Yes? Shifts over to the right. Okay, and the last one that we'll go over, we talked about a generator, but it's just we're using high frequency, so I'm not worried about this one right now. However, the target material, we have different types. We use tungsten. Gold can be used, and I don't know who's using gold, but I know Mammo's using molybdenum, and so these are other targets. So when the atomic number goes up, so does the average energy. That's all you have to remember, that when the atomic number goes up, so does the energy level. Okay? So, with that being said, we have our chart. This is what you have in front of you. I hope that you go back, you can fill it in, and go back and write why. You have to know why. You cannot simply memorize this, because I can change this to decrease if I need to. Make sense? It's a whole new world, isn't it? We're speaking a whole new language now. Okay, so I have a few of you that's already reached out to me for today. So I have responded to you. Remember, I cannot have everyone, so if you are interested in being here, you can do so, but you need to let me know so that I can let you know if I have room for you, okay? Bring your questions. Bring your questions. That's how I like tutoring to go, with questions. If not, we'll just have a staring contest. Okay, anything else? Have any questions before we depart for the day?
One more question about
Sure.
KVP. So I get on the graph, when you turn up the KVP, it's to the right.
Right.
Because you're just dealing with higher energies.
Higher energy.
Yeah, on that one.
Mm-hmm.
What I think where the part that's slightly confusing for me is the up.
Right.
To me, I can just accept that it's going to increase the number of X-rays, but to me, the KV, like the power of the X-rays, the quality, it's not the number.
No, I get it. That's why it doesn't directly control it. But if you increase, okay, so here's and this is the simplest way. It may not always be, because this is definitely going to be generated differently. But let's just say we stopped here, right? If this was our original KVP, right? We know that we have not generated any characteristic X-rays to add to this right here. So when we start to increase, yes, it's depicting characteristic, and I think this is what's probably throwing you off, because these are exact values. But when you start to look at, if you start to increase in higher energy beyond 50, we start to introduce the probability of K interactions. So when we start to get into past that 69 level, we know we're already going to be generating K, sometimes L, photons into the mix. Would you say that is adding to the quantity of photons inside of the X-ray tube? I mean, inside of the X-ray beam?
I know
if I introduce one K characteristic photon, is that increasing the quantity of the beam? Hello?
I would say yes.
Okay, so that's just the theory behind it. So it's basically saying as soon as you start to introduce characteristic photons, you're already adding to the quantity of the beam. Now, if we introduce, and I think the way that they were explaining it here, and I want you to read this specific section, because it made a lot of sense to me. Let's see. Third. I want to say back on page 69, it kind of made it to the point where it made a little bit more sense, and I thought I had copied it down to put it on there. No, page 70. When the KVP is increased at the control panel, larger potential difference occurs in the X-ray tube, giving it more electrons with kinetic energy to produce X-rays and increasing the kinetic energy overall. So when you increase the kinetic energy, like you were saying earlier, when you increase the kinetic energy of the filament electrons, you're losing less to heat and more gain to X-ray interactions. So
That's why it's not a direct.
That's what I'm saying. It's not directly. It is not.
It's like a side effect.
Exactly. That's the way. When I say effect, you can say a side effect. It just happens to happen when you increase KVP. It's a resulting, but does not control it. If I want to double my photons, I am going to double my what?
Yeah.
Thank you. But if I want to increase the energy of my photons, then I'm going to increase my what?
You're also going to get an increase of photons altogether. A slight increase.
You're going to get an increase of photons, but not directly proportional. And that's where we get into the confusing. Yes, it's a result of, we do get more photons, but it does not control it. Because again, I can go from 25 kV to 50 kV and never introduce characteristic into the mix at all. I've just increased the kinetic energy.
It explains the upwardness of the curve, the movement upward.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So that's on page 70, right above the critical concept. That's where I saw it. I was like, no, that makes sense. Okay. All right, guys. Well, I think I am done. If y'all have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me. And again, if you want to see me later on, I'll be here, but you got to let me know. Okay? Does anybody have any other questions for me before we exit? No? Good job, guys. It was a long road ahead. I know. Woo! It was bumpy. It was a bumpy ride. But we made it. We made it through chapter 6. Okay? All right. Celebration of knowledge on Friday. Bye, guys.